The Treaty of Versailles was a very significant treaty in history, and the events around it shape our world as we know it today. It was a way to compromise the end of World War I, get revenge on the Allied powers, and prevent another global war from happening. Instead, it failed, causing the opposite to happen. Powers rose again, and World War II began. Let's start with a little context of how the First World War happened.
The main alliances we see in World War I were first made in the late 1800s. France and Russia became allies in 1894 due to their fear of the newer German Empire rising to power and the Triple Alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Then, in 1898, Germany expanded their battle fleet and wanted to ally with Britain, but Britain decided to ally with France, Russia, and Japan. Around this time, the French and Germans fought over Morocco. The German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted to pressure the French and British alliance, but the British helped the French and did not step back. The next time the Germans tried to seize Morocco, the British backed up the French once more, and Germany realized they could not get it. Through the Moroccan crisis, the French and British alliance was strengthened.
Another event that raised tensions was the Balkan Wars. The first war was between the Ottoman Empire and countries that had broken off from it, at that time known as the Balkan League. The Ottoman Empire lost, and later the Balkan League fell apart. There was another Balkan War, and in the power void left by the Ottomans, tensions grew between Serbia and Austria-Hungary. That in turn led Austria-Hungary and its ally, Germany, to decide that a war with the Serbs would be needed at some point to strengthen Austria-Hungary's position. Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination was one of the last events leading up to the war. The Duke was at Sarajevo to inspect imperial and armed forces, and on the last day went through a parade with his wife. Young Bosnians spread out to kill him. There was a failed attempt at killing him with a bomb, and two of them were too afraid. After this chaos, one assassin by coincidence was able to shoot the Duke and his wife. Because of the pre-existent pressure in Europe, the assassination was the last push to the war.
Austria-Hungary then wanted to declare war on Serbia. The only thing that would come in their way would be Serbia's support from Russia.
Austria turned to its ally, Germany, on July 5th, a week after Franz Ferdinand's assassination. Kaiser Wilhelm II gave Austria what it wanted, the promise of Germany's faithful support if Russia came to Serbia's aid.
Austria-Hungary gave Serbia 10 demands to meet, but they didn't agree to them, so they declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914.
The Central Powers were Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. The five main powers of the Allied forces were Great Britain, France, Japan, and Russia, and the US. There were smaller nations that were a part of the Allied powers, and some were Serbia, Montenegro, and Belgium.
When the U.S. entered the war in 1917, the Central Powers tried to push them back, but the Allied powers did not falter. At the end of April, there were many American soldiers in France, and the other side was tired of fighting. In 1918, the Central Powers knew they couldn't win, and Germany's allies withdrew from the war. In November, the German army was fighting alone, and they knew they would lose, so they requested an armistice with the U.S.
The President of the U.S., Woodrow Wilson, gave the 14-point speech before a meeting of Congress held on January 8, 1918. Wilson talked about his vision for secure peace in Europe that would last long. Wilson had to speak with other winning countries at the Paris Peace Conference. Many disagreed with the 14 points and wanted harsher punishments for Germany. Wilson wanted for an establishment of an international governing body of United Nations for the purpose of guaranteeing political independence and territorial integrity to great and small countries alike. When Wilson got back from Paris with a treaty including the idea of the League of Nations, the people in the United States did not want to participate in it. A Republican congressman led a battle against the treaty because he thought the treaty and League of Nations undercut U.S. autonomy in international matters. In the end, they didn't ratify the treaty and they didn't join the League of Nations.
In Germany, there were negative reactions to the treaty and protests on the streets. Germany had to agree to sign the treaty, and they had to agree to take responsibility for the damage the war had caused. Because Germany was the one that requested an armistice to end the war, they were obligated to sign the Treaty of Versailles. After all the fighting in World War I, Germany's soldiers and government were exhausted and defenseless. They were expected to sign it because if they did not, everyone would return to fighting. Even though there were many unfair requirements in the treaty, Germany had to accept them without rejection.
There wasn't very much of a choice because the other countries had won. So the winner gets the spoils.
Because of the treaty, Germany's army was restricted to 100,000 men. Their forced army services were prohibited, and their soldiers had to be volunteers. Their navy was restricted to 15,000 men. In the treaty, it said that the German government wasn't allowed to produce warplanes, submarines, tanks, weapons, etc. About 10% of their land was given to other countries. The German troops were not allowed to go into Rhineland because it became demilitarized. As part of the war reparations, Germany was forced to pay 132 billion gold marks, or about $269 billion in our time. It took Germany 92 years to pay it off. They stopped backing up their currency with gold so they could make more money to pay off the debt. This caused major hyperinflation, devaluing the currency to the point that 4 years after the signing of the treaty, 42 billion marks were worth the equivalent of 1 American cent. This hyperinflation caused problems for the people as their income was worth much less and the economy was collapsing.
If you lived in the city, you ended up in squalor. There was a lot of theft. There was a lot of people being criminals just to get bread because they had kids at home that were starving and they needed to get something, but nothing, there wasn't enough money. The money was worth so little that it was cheaper to use money as wallpaper than to buy wallpaper.
The treaty was meant to end the European conflicts and keep the world in peace for a long time, but it was more of an agreement to stop fighting, which only lasted about 20 years. No country was really satisfied with the treaty, and tensions would only get worse. Many people were upset by the treaty, and the devastation from the war guilt clause in Germany was a reason to grow back into power.
He didn't start out as a dictator. Okay, he started out as just a regular ruler who then came up with these coolest ideas of building streets all through Germany. Okay, so the entire freeway system in Germany was a government project, but it got people work, money, so people could go back to living a life. How did Hitler come to power? Slowly, surely, sneaky. Nobody follows an evil person right like that. They will worm their way in, and before you know it, you are hooked. So always watch what's going on, because history tends to repeat itself, because we forget lessons like this.
The Treaty of Versailles was a failure in diplomacy because of the unfair requirements forced on Germany and becoming the new source of contention in Europe. It caused the rise of Hitler and the reason for the Second World War.